when it comes to talking, especially about the next election, and even preparing about the next election, we've heard a lot of commentators talk about how the Tory party has outmaneuvered Labour on like spending on like schools, NHS, and things like that. But this really hasn't been a colossal move to actually fill the gap of that spending. It's merely papering over the cracks, shall we say. And like I say, the Tory catch-up fund that we've seen is a drop. It's a drop in a bucket, which really needs to be filled. Because if you imagine that the Tories are so committed to this levelling up agenda, why wouldn't they spend the money on helping the kids in the most deprived areas in the UK catch up so that they can later on, in about 15 to 20 years roughly, become productive and engaged members of society and can contribute to the UK economy? But of course, as we've said before, the Conservatives are not interested in any of that long-term thinking. And deep down, the Conservatives do not want to spend money. They just do not. But we've seen, especially throughout the pandemic, them spending basically just enough so that they're not accused of being negligent or like not providing enough, but not too much either, so that, you know, people don't actually come to realize that actually state intervention and the state stepping in some areas can be quite a good thing. But of course, like I say, it's against the Tory nature to spend money. And even with Rishi Sunak's last budget, the Chancellor of Exchequer, there are 8% budget cuts coming in across all departments. So we know austerity is back on the menu. And again, COVID will be blamed for that. But of course, this isn't what people voted for Brexit. They wanted a better life, a better future, because that's what the Brexiteers promised them. And of course, as we've said many times before, leaving the EU and blaming the EU for what essentially were UK problems, which the UK government could solve, sooner or later, they're going to cotton on. And like I say, Johnson can only provide so much hot air to keep his balloon afloat for so long. So let's jump into today's article then, and please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button down below. And of course, there is my link to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, well, buy me a coffee. And thank you to all those people who do support me that way. And of course, the YouTube memberships are now open as well. So, on to today's article. This comes from The Guardian, and the title is Punishing the Young Serves Johnson's Politics of Nostalgia. Boris Johnson's government has made some very controversial spending decisions since the March of 2020, such as the $37 billion on a malfunctioning test and trace system, or the $3.7 billion of COVID-related contracts flagged by the Transparency International as potentially tainted by corruption. The unprecedented nature of the pandemic has destroyed any veer of fiscal restraint, and the cost of furlough scheme alone is approaching over £70 billion. Some of these decisions were rash, while others were justifiable given the emergency at hand. But none has been as conspicuously destructive as the decision to deliver only just a fraction of the catch-up funding for our schools recommended by the government's own education recovery czar. Only about the $1.5 billion was actually offered, or just 1/10 of what Sir Kevan Collins had recommended before he resigned in protest shortly after the announcement in early June. And the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who, quote, said, found so few opportunities to say no over the past 15 months, has finally rediscovered his inner Margaret Thatcher. This is not merely a controversy about education. It is key to understanding Johnsonism in practice, which, for all the appeal to levelling up and fiscal extravagance, shares with Sunak a disregard for the long-term future. The politics of nostalgia meshes well with the economics of austerity where children and young people are concerned, with neither ideology offering actually any serious hope for any national renewal. The economic arguments for spending more to compensate for the loss of learning during the pandemic are now very well rehearsed. British children have lost more than half a year of normal school, which the Institute for Fiscal Studies calculates could translate into 350 billion of lost earnings over a lifetime and 100 billion of extra loss of tax revenue. These sorts of calculations help to justify the decision in the Netherlands to commit an additional £2,500 per pupil per year compared to what the UK has done, equaling just £100 extra per pupil. Public spending on education alone is just one of the central ways that the market-orientated socialists, such as Britain, strive to reduce inequality. An expert consensus has developed in recent decades that money spent on early years education offers disproportionate benefits when it comes to tackling a lifelong impact of a disadvantaged background. Thinking that was instrumental in New Labour's introduction of Sure Start and free nursery places for 3 and 4 year olds. The closure of schools and early years settings will have fallen particularly hard on disadvantaged children, who are likely to have unequal access to technology and smaller homes and live in neighbourhoods where infections and therefore school closures were far higher, and inequalities in readings of maths have deepened along class and geographic lines. Many of these will have lifelong impacts. Learning aside, young people have always suffered deeply in many other ways, whether it be loneliness and stress faced by university students or the job losses they felt disproportionately on the under 25s. The mental health of children and young people in Britain was already one of the most shameful social indicators before COVID-19, and referrals to mental health services jumped by an astonishing 35% in the year prior to the pandemic. And now this looks set to get worse. No amount of catch-up funding will address the crisis if it only leads to a further narrowing of the curriculum and to more testing. But when all the government has is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Despite its not unreasonable mindset to those approaching adulthood under these circumstances. It is striking that nobody is standing up particularly or politically and naming this national abandonment of the young. What does it say about a nation when it can find £372 billion and counting to fight a pandemic, but strives to shave off every penny of the cost of renewing itself in the aftermath? This is a trajectory for social nihilism, a political project that has no spending limit when it comes to Tory donors, employers and voters in target seats, but refuses to see the value in the next generation of employees or citizens. The fact that children and young people are extremely unlikely to be harmed by COVID-19 may be too obvious to need pointing out, or else sound like the prelude to an argument against lockdowns and school closures. But on the contrary, the evidence is that over the past 15 months, we have witnessed one of the most remarkable acts of collectible sacrifices since 1945. For the young, for the old, this low risk for the high risk, this is something to be recognised and celebrated. Instead, our political and media idiosyncrasy at the moment have simply pocketed the gift and barely even mentioned it. The claim recited by the intellectual friends of the Conservative Party is that they have moved left on economics and right on culture. But the fiscal treatment of children, which will do harm to disadvantaged youngsters, especially, shows that Johnsonism is really just moving right on culture, all the way down, and the efforts to move left on economics turn out to be electorally motivated and gestures toward particular voter groups. The result is a political regime that offers symbolic recognition to regions and communities, so that the so-called Red Wall, and that were so injured by Thatcher 4 decades ago to the various monetary recessions of the early 1980s, while ignoring communities today that are being injured right in front of our own eyes. Sigmund Freud made the distinction between mourning, to which a person suffers the loss, and injury, to which they slowly and painfully move on from. The melancholia in which they turn to is on themselves and in a hateful search for what has been lost. Refusing to accept that is now gone. In the early 2000s, cultural theorist Paul Gilroy adopted the same language to diagnose Britain's post-colonial melancholy. suggesting that an unrelenting flag culture of flag waving and Churchill worship has signified an unhappy, angry quest for something that had been mislaid. A new era, enforced Union Jacks and government yachts, has proved Gilroy more right than he could possibly ever feared. Boris Johnson didn't invent this melancholy culture, but he's encouraged and exploited it ruthlessly. In it, there is jingoistic headlines for the tabloids, as if there is the attention-seeking interventionists of ministers in the contested culture war issues, but the attitude to the younger generations is also a component. The insistence that the future cannot and must not be that of the past is suddenly exercised for fiscal restraint when it comes to children's education, and is symptomatic of something far deeper than mere economics. It is the self-pursuing aspect of melancholia, where Freud identified today's children are the ones on the receiving end. So we really, really do have a serious problem, because this is going to cause huge economic harm down the line. I mean, you already saw the numbers. That it's literally, when you take this is basically £100 per pupil, when the Netherlands, they're spending an extra £2,500 per pupil. And then, obviously, this equates to 350 billion of lost earnings over a lifetime. That's a huge number. And then 100 billion of lost tax revenue. That's an astonishing number, and I've said it before. This is why we've got to look at policy and understand the impacts of what it will have on our society. That's why policy is always far, far more interesting to talk about than culture war nonsense. But this is what Johnson and co are engaging in. Labour should be shouting from the rooftops, saying that they are betraying the younger generation, that, shouting to all the parents, saying that the Tories are betraying your children. They're only giving you £100 extra per pupil per school. This, again, could be a fantastic battle cry to maybe even force the government into another U-turn. Again, I don't know if it will happen or not, but I'm sort of shocked that there's nothing there. And it should be there. There should be a massive... Labour should not be, it should be literally putting on its brass knuckle gloves and going to town on Johnson. But it's not, unfortunately. And again, I don't know why it's not, but the fact that this COVID recovery grant is not enough and is going to do so much long-term damage to this country. I mean, 100 billion in lost tax revenue and then 350 billion in lost earnings over a lifetime is nothing to sneeze at. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button, and of course down below there are links to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.